one, go.
Great. Hi, everybody. You have Shravan Balaji here.
Hey, and you have Christian Sathan.
So we're here to bring you the third episode of our election series, focusing on the election of 1976. One of
1976.
yeah, that. One of kind of like the last, modern elections before we get into this kind of crazy postmodern era. And you have it's the parties are not super ideologically different. You have a lot of kind of geographic differences as opposed to ideological differences determining outcomes. But it's an election that we find to be super interesting and that has a lot of political relevance in today's day and age. So yeah, with that being said, I guess we want to start off by talking about the second half of Richard Nixon's administration, which kind of sets the tone for what this election actually is. So without getting too crazy involved with Watergate, Krish, you just want to kind of give a quick breakdown of where the United States was on January 20th, 1973, right after Richard Nixon won his second term?
Yeah, sure. So yes, as we all know, Richard Nixon won in 1972, as our last episode went over, with one of the most thumping, basically, majorities of all time in a presidential election, probably actually the second to LBJ. However, he actually did not, and deliberately so, did not pursue a coattail strategy. And so what that means is that Democrats kept control of both the House and the Senate through that election. And so what Richard Nixon's second term saw in terms of, overall, let's say, so to speak, the country going forward, we see finally the ramp down and ending of the Vietnam War as U.S. troops withdraw from South Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese government shortly thereafter moves to reunite the country. I think that's piece one. And effectively, it's a large part of the Vietnam strategy ultimately failing. I think the second big thing to talk about here is that we also have the first oil shock, which is critical, coming out of the Yom Kippur War of 1973, which led to, for the first time, basically in modern history, massive spike in oil prices across the board in the United States and across the West, as Arab nations decided to launch an oil embargo in response to U.S. support for Israel during that war. What that led to effectively was gas rationing in the U.S. And a sense of sort of economic disenchantment, economic collapse, or not collapse, but economic anger that had not been seen for a long time.
Did you say malaise?
Malaise, one might even say. Yeah, great word for it.
But on that note, right, like you're taking into account a lot of these different factors. The world in the early mid 1970s is still reeling from a lot of the social and cultural upheavals of the 60s. There's a lot of chaos across the board. To quickly touch upon Watergate without getting too crazy in the weeds. Basically, the Nixon Committee to Re-elect the President, also known as CREEP, was involved with hiring men to break into the Democratic Party's national headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in D.C. The outcome of that resulted in these actions eventually being found out. There was an investigation into what happened, as well as the inevitable cover-up that would follow, and this took time. The public became fully aware of these allegations in 1973, and the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee at the time, a guy from Newark, New Jersey named Peter Rodino, was very careful and deliberate as to how he approached the administration. In modern context, he was kind of like if Adam Schiff wasn't in love with his voice and doing media appearances every 30 seconds. But Rodino really did a very good job of handling the investigation slowly, calmly, and respectfully, to the point where even Republicans, kind of understood where he was going with the investigation. And, in a time where hyperpartisanship wasn't really a thing, the outcome was that by mid-1974, as more and more of Nixon's misdeeds came to light, the Nixon administration was in its last days. Now, one important thing that happened in 1973 was the elevation of a congressman from Michigan. I believe he was the House Minority Leader at the time. This guy, Gerald Ford. So Gerald Ford is from Grand Rapids, Michigan. He grew up quite poor. He played football at the University of Michigan, and then he put himself through Yale Law School as a boxing and a football coach. So Gerald Ford is a pretty self-made guy. His wife, Betty Ford, is, for especially the 1970s, one of the most kind of outgoing and, libertine political women of her time. When she becomes First Lady, there's a lot of talk on how she openly discusses the fact that she supports birth control, that she has had an abortion, etc. So this is a very interesting couple power dynamic that goes on. It's very different from a lot of the couples that follow. But Ford gets elevated to the vice presidency through the 25th Amendment after the resignation of Spiro Agnew due to concerns over tax fraud. Agnew was Nixon's vice presidential nominee in 68, became vice president, was again on the ticket in 72, and now he's out of the office. And Ford is far more moderate and someone really from the so-called Rockefeller wing of the party. He's certainly not an ideological conservative by any means. So when Nixon inevitably resigns, Ford becomes president. And when Ford becomes president, it gets very interesting because Ford has never been elected to either the vice presidency or the presidency. He made his way to the top through the means of Congress, much like an unwitting Frank Underwood, so to speak, if you guys have ever seen House of Cards. But as soon as Ford comes to power, he's in his 3 years, as less than 3 years as president, like 2 1/4, 2 1/3, it's some of the busiest years in American history. There are 2 assassination attempts on Ford's life, one by someone who was trying to gain attention for the Manson family, if you ever heard of Charles Manson.
Wow. That's a throwback. I mean, just imagine getting got by someone from the Manson family. It's like, really, bro? Like, come on, you missed your moment there a little.
Oh, absolutely. And one by someone who was kind of looking to make a name for herself after she fell out of favor with a lot of her left-wing groups due to the fact that she was an FBI informant. It's interesting to note that both of these people are women. And that's something that I think presents an interesting dynamic for Ford. And these assassination attempts both happened in California within like a couple days of each other. So that reflects quite a bit of uncertainty as well. And one of the things that, is one of my personal pet peeves with Gerald Ford is how he handled the New York financial crisis. So I know those of you who are excited to move to New York or already live in New York probably understand 2020 New York to be one of the safest cities in the country, one of the safest big, large cities in the world, and of course outside of COVID, but in terms of violent crime, absolutely, one of the safest cities in the world. But 1970s New York was quite the opposite. It was pretty much the definition of
it's classic New York. Come on.
And if you've seen a lot of the movies from the time, whether it's Taxi Driver, or even if you've seen The Joker, you kind of get a sense for what New York in the 70s and early 80s was like. And New York in the 1970s basically is out of money and asks Gerald Ford and the federal government for help. And notoriously, Ford says no. Saying no to New York for when they ask for federal help is a very politically popular thing to do for any president. But Ford famously does this in a headline in the New York Post where it's said that Ford says, "To New York, drop dead," which is one of the more famous headlines in American history. So clearly Ford is dealing with urban decay. He's dealing with the fall of Saigon, which also happens in 1975. He's dealing with the beginning of the inflation crisis, an oil embargo. He has to go to the Shah of Iran, who was pretty much the only Middle Eastern country willing to supply us oil at the time, how that changes. but he's got to deal with lots of things. And he's a congressional leader. He's someone who's been in Congress for more than 2 decades. He's definitely someone with experience, but a lot of people at the time from the outside questioned his wit and his ability to make tough decisions. And probably the toughest decision that he had to make was his decision to pardon Richard Nixon. And Krishan, do you want to talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, so basically what had happened was, Nixon had gone through the entire Watergate process, had decided finally to quote unquote resign for the good of the country. That's where we get that famous photo of him, boarding sort of Marine One for the last time, taking off from the White House. Very, very exciting stuff. But, just because Nixon resigned does not mean that the issues or the crimes basically that he committed and then covered up went away. And so basically coming into, Ford's term, one of the first decisions that he really has to make is this idea of, will he pardon Nixon or not? And to sort of weigh the pros and cons here, a former president had never been tried for crimes. So that's number one. And so
they all probably should, though.
Yeah, I mean, all of them should, obviously. That goes without saying. But I think that what Ford was effectively trying to weigh was, from the perspective of, let's say, Ford, he's basically just framing it as this idea of the country needs to heal. And, in the words of Barack Obama, we need to look forward, not backwards. But at the same time, what's really being considered here is, Richard Nixon is still, while being an unpopular figure for all the corruption and whatnot, he is still something of a cultural touchstone amongst conservatives, given, his thumping of McGovern and the damn hippies and all of those folks. And so if Ford were to allow Nixon to go ahead and be prosecuted like a common criminal, it could damage him significantly among that crowd. So Ford is kind of faced with a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, and ultimately decides to issue a blanket pardon to Nixon. And I don't remember the exact phrasing, but to the effect of, for all crimes you may or may not have committed or may not commit in the future, which is some pretty incredible legal language if you think about it. And frankly, I would say sets the precedent for a lot of the lack of desire amongst politicians to keep other politicians accountable. It's what, in part, set the groundwork for the Bush administration and its cronies not being tried after 2008, and still is definitely a political decision that lives with us today.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely something that I think still rings in the minds of a lot of Americans. Now, at the time, it wasn't really the most popular thing to do, and for whatever historians are surveyed on whether or not it was the right thing to do, they tend to go more or less back and forth. But one of the inevitable kind of outcomes of all this is the creation of this culture in American politics where when crimes or injustices happen, politicians look, to move forwards, not backwards, and they tend to forgive those who created the crimes. And when you think about the 2008 financial crisis, the horrors of the Iraq War, all of these things, our presidents and our political leaders had decided to just move on, as opposed to actually, redress what actually happened. And if, for those of you who have any experience in kind of post-conflict studies or, justice and kind of fairness trials that have happened after, say, genocides in Cambodia or Rwanda, what you'll learn is that the most important thing is to actually punish the people who committed wrongdoing. Blanket, forgiveness just isn't a feasible way to get peace and justice. So that's kind of like a shocking outcome of all of this. And I guess the last pre-election thing that we want to touch upon is, Nixon loses his political power. He resigns. Ford comes into power in August 1974. And obviously Nixon is very unpopular, and that mars the Republican Party in 1974. And the election margins that the Democrats get in those midterms are just otherworldly. They already have a majority in Congress and the Senate, but they elect a lot of very important young people to political office for the first time. So I'm just going to read some names who you may or may not recognize. But, Chris Dodd, famously of Dodd-Frank, Tom Harkin from Iowa, ran for president a few times, was considered as a potential VP nominee at a couple other times. Max Baucus, who was a senator from Montana, who was responsible for kind of watering down Obamacare and a lot of the financial reform that came out in the late 2000s. So you have all these like very influential politicians who get their origin in the 1974 election. And that's something that, is very important to consider as well.
Yeah, and I'd say the big political thing that I would put forward about the so-called Watergate babies, and there's a great piece that was written by Matt Stoller back in 2016. It's on The Atlantic, and it's called "How Democrats Killed Their Populist Soul." Would recommend folks give it a read if you get a chance. But one thing to keep in mind about this, post-Watergate generation that came out of the midterms of '74 is that they kind of saw the Democrats who came before them, a lot of times who were sort of the classic New Deal Democrats, as being a part of sort of the same corrupt political machine that allowed Richard Nixon ultimately to commit his own crimes, because they had been involved in the war in Vietnam, they had been involved in segregation at home as well. And so these guys came in as sort of this anti-corruption, anti-war wave. And then ultimately, we're able to incorporate things like the War Powers Act into Congress and the Church Committee, which we'll talk about Frank Church later on, and had successes, but also overthrew basically the New Deal committee chairs, who had been the ones who had been significant on antitrust, for example, and frankly, just Keynesian economic system that we found ourselves in. So that's a side effect of '74, but it'll definitely pay much bigger dividends later down the line and in our present day political system.
Yeah, and one thing just to jump off that was, the term career politician very much shifts at this point, right? The classic New Deal career politician often got their background in, labor and organizing, tended to work in urban areas, weren't necessarily people with degrees from, the Ivy Leagues or other great schools, but they very much were not particularly representative of the intelligentsia in many cases. Whereas a lot of these Watergate babies very much were inspired by the culture wars of the 60s, the anti-war movement, were intellectuals and were people who wanted to represent an intelligentsia within the Democratic Party. Many of them were previously supporters of Eugene McCarthy, which certainly influenced their ability to, in their viewpoints in how they approached political issues once in office. So that's something to consider as well.
Yep.
Krish, I guess it's time we move on to the Democratic nomination.
Yeah, one quick thing I did want to talk about before we moved on, it was just inflation, because inflation is going to play a big role both in this election and the next election and the election after that. But real quick, where this comes from is basically Nixon decided to juice the economy in in the lead up to 72 in order to create really good economic conditions for his reelection. Does that and succeeds, but it's a huge amount of money basically being pumped into the system that's funded based off deficits that are now feasible because we've come off the gold standard. This leads prices to skyrocket. And in addition, with OPEC launching the economic blockade that we talked about earlier, CPI price indexes just kind of start shooting up. And what it leads to is reduced purchasing power and frankly, a whole lot of trauma for a generation of economists who kind of came of age in that period, as they saw, Keynesianism as quote unquote, like the god that failed, because it predicted that you should never see both GDP going flat and inflation skyrocketing, but that's exactly what they were seeing. So it's going to set the scene for a lot of the political action that's going to go forward here. But just wanted to give the 1 minute version of, what happened there.
Absolutely. All right, I guess moving on to the Democratic nomination. So at this point, the McGovern-Fraser Commission's rules have influenced the primary process deep enough to the point where, every state is generally allocating their delegates from the primary or the caucus contest. And of course, this is the first election where the Iowa caucus RIP Iowa Caucus 1976 to 2020.
Dead. Gone.
We will never see it in the same form again, and for good riddance, honestly. Iowa, you're not that special. But this is the first election where the Iowa caucus tends to have a disproportionate impact on the outcome of the election. And it really starts with this guy, a peanut farmer from Georgia, a former governor, whose name is, James E. Carter, Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter ends up living in Iowa 2 years in advance of the election so that he can get to know the people and get to, meet different people from within the party.
This is what we call retail politics.
Exactly. There's very much this kind of story that Tip O'Neill tells about Carter. And Tip O'Neill at the time, he becomes the Speaker of the House at the end of 1976. In 1974, he is the House Majority Leader. He's important in getting Nixon out of office, and obviously he's paying attention to presidential politics at the time. And Carter comes into his office one day and says, in 2 years, I'm going to run for president. I'm going to go to Iowa. I'm going to win in Iowa. And you're going to see me as president of the United States by January 20th, 1977. And Tip O'Neill is like, all right, like this guy's confident, but like he's the governor of Georgia and doesn't really seem to get along with many people, like whatever. But Carter ends up finding a way to pull it off. And he starts out with his victory in Iowa in the 1976 caucus. Now, he's helped by the fact that, of course, Ted Kennedy won't run in this election, which is funny because hold on until 1980 and you'll see a different story. But Kennedy, again, who was leading for much of the time, ends up not running in the election when it actually comes down to it. And Carter kind of is the little-known, dark horse candidate who ends up winning Iowa and almost immediately becoming a front runner for the nomination.
Yeah. Well, one thing to mention here, when we say win Iowa, there's a few different as we learned in 2020, there's a few different definitions of the word win. In this case, Carter came in second place, technically behind the uncommitted option for the Iowa caucus. So, when we think about it's kind of interesting because I think here you can start to see the beginnings of our modern primary system and how it builds up candidates, because Carter is explicitly running on the political strategy of quote unquote building momentum, assuming that a win in Iowa will get him more national recognition, which then he can leverage into wins in the future caucuses and primaries, which will ultimately snowball into a overwhelming lead in the delegate count. So this is really where you start to see the beginnings of that strategy, and you see it actually play out and be successful. And similar to how we've talked about New Hampshire in the last couple of elections, this is the election that starts to make the myth, so to speak, of the Iowa caucuses.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that's very important to kind of note here is just Carter had the kind of appeal for the Iowa caucus that really helped a lot of candidates down the road. I think it helped Barack Obama in 2008. It helped Pete Buttigieg in 2020. Is that there was a sense of novelty about Jimmy Carter in a time where Americans had just come off all-time highs in their trust in political institutions. Now on their way to all-time lows, which we see today. Carter was a younger, fresh face who people liked. People trusted him. He was a man of, very clear integrity. No one ever doubted that he was a man of God, someone who could connect with average people because he was trusted. And as most of you know, the key determining factor for undecided voters late in elections is trustworthiness, perceived honesty. And everyone, whether or not they liked what Carter had to say, people thought of him as a genuine, honest human being. So that definitely propelled Carter to success in the early state, and it would help him later on throughout the campaign.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and we can quickly kind of talk about some of the other folks who ran in 76, because there were a lot of them. I think probably one of the highest total candidate counts of any election. But you have a lot of the same names that we've heard in the past. Scoop Jackson comes out again to run. You have the senator from Washington, who's kind of the beginner of sort of the neocon agenda. You have some other folks like Sergeant Shriver, who, is, if you might remember, took over from Thomas Eagleton's disastrous time as VP for the candidate George McGovern. You have Jerry Brown. What's his nickname? Moonbeam? Right?
Something like that,
Something
yeah.
like that. Something weird like that. I don't know. You have Jerry Brown out of California, and you have Mo Udall, a representative, I believe, from Arizona. And then you have a few other folks who jump in ultimately, like Frank Church, famous for the Church Committee. But overall, it's kind of a smattering from the right and the left. But once again, kind of like Shravan says, ideology is not really actually the piece that matters as much for this nomination process amongst the Democrats. It's significantly much more about being a quote unquote fresh face, anti-corruption. And additionally, I think Carter did very well in the nomination process because he was representative of a new South. And one of the other people to run for the Democratic nomination was our friend, George Wallace, running again, this time as a Democrat. And Carter, also being from the South, is actually able to defeat Wallace in almost every contest in the South, finally putting him out of the Democratic nomination process.
Absolutely. And there's definitely certain other dynamics of Carter and his relationship with other Southern Democrats that are worth getting into in maybe the 1980 episode, because they do reflect his struggles to deal with Congress. But at this time, Carter is kind of this young, inspiring face for the Democratic Party. And the one person who I just think is interesting, who I want to touch upon briefly, is Jerry Brown. So Jerry Brown comes from a political family. He's the former mayor of Oakland, California. His dad was the governor of California. He actually beat Richard Nixon in 1962 when Nixon ran for governor. Jerry Brown gets elected to the governorship in 1974, and he actually ends up serving another 2 terms as governor of California from 2011 to 2019. So this man has been around in politics forever.
It's probably the longest gap, right, between like offices served, I would think, out of any politician. It's got to be, right? Like, that's wild.
But yeah, this man is found a way to be relevant in politics for a very long time. But, I think, again, people today often recognize California as this very kind of liberal wannabe utopia. But in the 1970s, California was kind of, the centerpiece for a lot of, key conservative policies. We'd just come off the Reagan terms. Reagan left office in 74. And Brown actually governed much more as a moderate at this time than he would as a particular liberal. And when he ran for president, he wanted to be someone who is able to kind of bring some form of austerity to the Democratic Party. He made this famous quote, I think he said when he decided to run for president, which was pretty late in the campaign, "The country is rich, but not so rich as we have been led to believe. The choice to do one thing may preclude another. In short, we are entering an era of limits." In other words, he was telling people that get prepared for austerity, which is kind of an insane thing coming from the governor of California in 2020, but a very normal thing in 1976.
Yep, absolutely. So like we said, Carter's strategy largely works out in terms of the Democratic nomination. He rolls into the Democratic convention with the majority of delegates, enough to win on the first ballot, and ultimately ends up picking Mondale as sort of someone who's a liberal, and really a compromise candidate, because Carter is seen as coming from the more conservative / moderate, southern part of the party. He wants to pick somebody to balance out that ticket. So going into the election of 76 on the Democratic side, we have Carter Mondale. But maybe it makes sense now for us to go into the Republican nomination a little bit, just because I think it's very, very interesting as a precursor to the rest of the conservative movement.
Absolutely. I think there's a great quote that Krishnan found for this, but let me just set the scene here. So Ford has never been elected president. He's never been elected vice president. So he's seen by a lot of Republicans, particularly more conservative Republicans, as a pretender to the throne, if you will. And the key contender that he has to face is someone we talked about.
Oh, sorry. One thing just to add real quick.
But
another reason that the conservatives don't like him is because he picks Rockefeller to be his VP. and Rockefeller is known to be from the liberal part of the party. So that's just one other thing to consider.
Yeah, no, that's very true. You have a moderate and a liberal Republican who are effectively leading the process here, and that's interesting. That's very interesting given today's context. But anyway, so we get into Reagan versus Ford. Reagan is a favorite of a lot of the kind of nascent conservative groups that now currently dominate American society and were even more dominant over the course of the 2000s. And these are the military-industrial complex. He does a lot of good work in working with like contractors in Southern California. He's very popular with ideological conservatives, kind of the free market conservative brand of the Republican Party, the think tanks.
The Goldwater rights.
Exactly. His ties with Goldwater certainly help him here as well. And he's very popular with social conservatives. Reagan he's tough on crime. He's
hates the Reds.
Yeah, hates the Reds. He's a very good candidate for this kind of three-legged stool of conservatism that we see developing. And Ford is not. So I think Reagan is someone who is very popular with the ideological wing of the party and deserves and seems to get a lot of attention for it very early on in the process. And I know today we might effectively find it crazy that anyone would seriously primary an incumbent president, but this was the reality in 1976, and it happened.
Yeah, and I think it definitely is, just to add to that, it was definitely helped by the fact that Ford served less than 2 years as president, and nobody had elected him. I think that added a lot of ideological heft to Reagan's challenge. But yeah, Shravan mentioned a quote that I think sums up pretty decently the ideological disputes and let's say conflict between the Reagan wing and the Ford wing of the Republican Party. And this was an excerpt from a speech that Reagan gave at the second annual Conservative Political Action Conference, also known as CPAC, also known as the greatest hive of scum and villainy to grace the shores of our nation's capital once a year. So here's the quote. "Is it a third party that we need? Or is it a new and revitalized second party, raising a banner of no pale pastels, but bold colors which could make it unmistakably clear where we stand on all issues troubling people?" That's Reagan at the second CPAC. Setting aside the attack on pastels, which I'm sure would not be taken well by many Republicans today, I think this really kind of lets you know that here's where Reagan stands. He believes in setting apart the Republican Party from the Democratic Party. He believes in ideological polarization. He believes that Republicans need to go further to the right in order to actually be successful. And it's kind of interesting because it's the inverse of a lot of the arguments I think that you hear. Not the inverse, but it's the let's say ideological opposite, but the same form of arguments that you hear from people on the left, which is that the Democratic Party doesn't do a good enough job of differentiating itself from the other party capital, Republicans. And we need to go further to the left in order to differentiate ourselves and therefore show voters what we stand for and win greater victories. I think that's yet to be proven out in the Democratic Party. But, if you know what happens in 1980, to some extent, it is proven out for the Republican Party. So, something to think about there.
Yeah. And so the primary season gets started. Ford wins New Hampshire. He wins Illinois. He wins Florida. Reagan's out of money. Reagan's looking for some help ASAP. And I think in a context very similar to 2020, Reagan gets some help from a Carolinian. And this Carolinian is a guy named Jesse Helms. So for those of you who have just been recently watching The Last Dance, you might know that Jesse Helms is probably one of the most violently racist senators who ever basically graced Congress. And this guy was in office until like the late 90s, early 2000s. And Helms is an ardent segregationist, an ideological conservative to the core. He was one of the key opponents of making Martin Luther King Day a national holiday. Just like, as you can tell, like clearly a great guy. But Helms finds a way to use his political network in North Carolina at the time and get Reagan enough help to win the state. And from there on, Reagan really tends to kind of steamroll his way through the Western United States, where he's already strong because of his roots in California, as well as Texas. And that's something that allows him to be a very real contender for the nomination.
Mhm.
Obviously, the comparison that we're making here is that to Jim Clyburn, who was, of course, one of the great civil rights icons, who's still currently in Congress, who endorsed Joe Biden before the South Carolina primary in February 2020. And Biden, who basically, had lost Iowa, come fifth in New Hampshire, finished second in Nevada, got routed though, and now was won, I think, 60% of the vote in South Carolina.
Yeah.
Steamrolled his way through Super Tuesday and is currently the Democratic nominee. Obviously, we're looking forward to the Zoom debate. I'm sure we'll probably have to live stream that or something. But at this point, Reagan is kind of the comeback kid, even if he's like 65. But he's the comeback kid, and he's doing very well. And Ford needs to kind of stem his momentum.
Yeah. And so Ford ultimately ends up eking out a victory in Michigan, his home state. And that allows him to regain a footing to run an even contest, basically, with Nixon going into, with Reagan. Freudian slip there, maybe, I don't know. But run an even enough contest with Reagan going into the convention. But it's incredibly, incredibly tight the whole way around. And actually, as they enter the Republican convention, Ford does not have a majority of the delegates on the first ballot in order to win, as far as I understand. So what it boils down to now is how are the state delegations ultimately going to vote? And here is where Reagan ends up making a bit of a mistake that unfortunately basically takes the nomination away from him in 76. And what he does is he preemptively is basically trying to reach out to the moderate wing of the party, unite them, and hopefully become the consensus nominee through that way. And so I forget, who does he pick? He picks basically a moderate in order to be his running mate, or presumptive running mate and vice president, going into 76. But what that does is it alienates all of the conservatives who had basically pushed him up to that point. They basically come into it with the idea of, hey, we pushed hard, donated, knocked on doors to get you elected, Reagan, and you're going to sell us down the line for some wishy-washy moderate. And it results basically in many conservatives being turned off of Reagan's nomination. And actually the state of Mississippi, their delegation ultimately decides to go and vote for Ford, which guarantees him the nomination on the first ballot.
And one thing you have to remember at this time is that, the Republican Party state machinery in a lot of these southern states is still very new. Not to say that they haven't been around, they haven't been contesting elections, but pretty much between the time of the New Deal and the signing of the Civil Rights Act, these states were just run so deeply by Democrats that, Republicans didn't have a shot. The famous saying is that, Democrats would vote for a yellow dog as long as they had a D next to their name. And now you kind of get this shift where it's basically that the Democratic Party has moved so left that the yellow dog has been choked blue, which gets you the term of a blue dog Democrat. Mm-hmm. And the Republican Party state machinery at this time is still very much kind of influenced on a national basis. So Ford is able to kind of lever his connections in Congress that obviously Reagan doesn't have as someone who's the governor of a state, as opposed to a congressional leader in Washington. Ford's able to lever those connections in order to get himself the votes in Mississippi and become the nominee. And it's one thing that I think is important and interesting to note here is Ford and Reagan give kind of back-to-back speeches at the convention after Ford wins on the first ballot. And Ford gets up, he gives a speech, and he famously kind of goes out and says, I'm looking into this crowd, I'm looking into this country, and he says, I like what I see. And it's this tone of kind of like moderate optimism that he offers to the nation and to the Republican Party. And Reagan goes up after him. And instead of saying that he likes what he sees or offering some hope, Reagan casts a variety of different kind of horrors or crises that the country is facing and speaks of them in this grim, dark tone. And the reason why he does that is partially, yes, I'm sure he wants to inform people of crises, but he does.
Reagan, well known for really trying to inform the electorate and make sure that, they know what's going on.
Well, he's someone who thrived off of emotional kind of appeal. And
emotional labor, sweetie.
Okay, that's a Twitter joke we don't need to get into right now. But yeah, so Reagan is making this kind of emotional appeal, and he's scaring people. He's telling people that there are dark times ahead. And that's something that I think is very much true of Reagan and of any conservative, successful conservative that really follows him, whether it's George W. Bush, whether it's Trump. It's that the world, to quote Thomas Hobbes, it's nasty, brutish, short. It's a dark world that we have to deal with, and only someone like Reagan who can recognize those horrors is capable of dealing with them. That's a very much a recurring theme in the 1980 presidential election. He's also able to inspire optimism when it suits his political brand, but I think that's interesting here where you have the presidential nominee go up and speak, and he gives like a fine speech, and then someone who's not even the vice presidential nominee, someone who lost the nomination contest, comes up and speaks and gives a more powerful speech that really captivates the hearts and minds of the Republican Party at the time.
Yeah. And I think there are probably strong parallels that you can draw probably pretty directly between that speech and the speech that Donald Trump gave at the 2016 Republican convention, talking about American carnage, and sort of that same sort of, for lack of a better term, demonic, oppression of Americans. But anyway, so basically, Ford ends up winning the nomination, sort of on the back of this unforced political error from Reagan, as well as his own connections amongst the Republican Party apparatus, and ends up picking Bob Dole of Dole Fruits fame. I'm kidding, he's not really a pineapple guy, but ends up picking Bob Dole to be his vice presidential candidate. Dole shows up later on in these elections, so we'll go over him in more detail later, but for now, just know that he's there. And so actually coming out of this convention, we kind of see a reverse of what we saw in 72, where in 72, we saw Nixon leading the govern basically by 30 points and then never taking his foot off the gas from there. Now we see a flip where actually Carter is leading, the Carter ticket and the Democratic ticket is leading Ford and Dole by about the same, around 30 points. But in classic Democratic fashion, can't let a good advantage go actually benefit you. They immediately start to work cutting down on that lead. So Shravan, do you want to go over some of the things that made sure that lead was never the same as right after the convention?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think there's a variety of different things at play here. First off, I think the parallel you can draw to today's kind of election cycle is, generic Democrat beats Trump on the ballot by 15 points, but once you actually have a candidate, that margin really narrows, right? And that's something that I think very much is part of the election cycle here as well. People would vote for any Democrat to replace Ford and Nixon and kind of the horrors of that administration. But Jimmy Carter is not the most skilled political campaigner. And there's a variety of things we can talk about. There's one of the key things about Jimmy Carter was he had this, I think, very noble but clear misconception that the American people wanted their president to be someone who was a humble, kind of projected a working class image. And he would do things like small things like carry his own bags and turn off the lights to preserve electricity and show people that he was doing that. And he really didn't get the sense that Americans wanted a more regal, powerful political figure, which
imperial political figure, one might even say.
Yeah, you live in an empire, you want.
Nobody wanted Caesar to wear a sweater when it was too cold outside.
Yeah,
and
this is all stuff that happens kind of later on when Carter's actually president, but they're reflective of his type of character and his political instincts. So I think one of the big issues here is that they come out of the convention cycle, but the first thing that happens is the American bicentennial, and Ford gets to give this speech kind of celebrating American ingenuity and the American spirit and all that glorious crap. And this gets him a lot of goodwill from a lot of people. Remember that the average voter isn't someone who's super ideological, but someone who kind of like wants their president to make them feel comfortable and feel good. And it's disappointing, but that's the nature of politics in this country, right? And, Carter is running as someone who isn't involved with Watergate. He's running as this kind of, modicum of like integrity and honor. But there's this incident where he gives an interview, and in the interview, he basically admits to kind of cheating on his wife in his mind many times. I think he uses the quote like, "I've had lust in my heart before,"
which I think is like, to be fair, it's like a very deeply Christian thing, right? Because like Jesus does say, you can commit adultery in your heart, right? It's not just about the physical act of cheating on your wife. So all this to say, once again, like these are things that, are truly, issues that religious people and, normal people, not normal, religious people can be normal, blah, 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 but religious people and non-religious people struggle with, but it's not stuff that the American electorate wants to hear about its candidates.
Yeah. Like one thing that I think, if you haven't noticed by, almost 4 years into Donald Trump, is that people don't really like apologies from their politicians. Like no one really cares. No one wants anyone to apologize. And Carter kind of like trying to show weakness here isn't really taken well by the American people. And there are like very much substantive issues that he has to deal with, right? Like Carter doesn't have a lot of national experience, and Ford and Dole, who are on the national stage, hammer him and Mondale for not having the requisite national experience to lead the country. He's the governor of Georgia. He was there for one term. He's a peanut farmer. Yeah. They attack him for being vague on a lot of issues. I think Carter, he was considered a moderate. He was considered this member of the New South, but he wasn't someone who was very much kind of, a policy wonk by any means. Even though he was a brilliant guy, it's hard to discount his intellect. He wasn't someone who really was able to elucidate his stance on issues very clearly.
Yeah.
That affected him as well.
Yeah, especially in the first debate, in the debates that Carter and Ford had, which are actually the first televised debates since I think like 1960. So there had been almost a 16-year gap in this. But Ford was well regarded in those debates and kind of was considered the consensus winner, just given his grasp of the issues versus Carter's perceived inexperience or incompetence. And so that, so like Robin said, that plays a big role in Ford making up some of the difference versus Carter. But, Ford and Dole also end up stalling out and, having severe issues. One of the famous gaffes that Ford makes during the election is he basically ends up saying at one point, Eastern Europe has never been under Soviet domination and will never be under Soviet domination during a Ford presidency. And he also says that, the Poles are not under Soviet domination, stuff like that. And, obviously it's a gaffe. He knows that the Soviet Union, is controlling sort of the Warsaw Pact states. But it's seen in a very bad light because it reinforces pre-existing ideas about, Ford as being soft on the Reds, which ultimately have a big role in turning conservatives and movement conservatives off of him as well.
Absolutely. And another debate gaffe that I just think is interesting to point out, and after that we'll kind of get into how the televised media influences the selection. But another debate gaffe is when Bob Dole is debating Walter Mondale, and Dole goes to Mondale and says, all the wars in the 20th century have been Democrat wars. And those Democrat wars have killed American citizens. And if you think about it, it's not the most unfair criticism on a purely like plain factual basis, right? Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, was president for World War I, FDR for World War II, Harry Truman for the Korean War, and the Vietnam War had its origins in the Truman administration. Eisenhower was involved, but it was really both Kennedy and Johnson who escalated the Vietnam War. So it is a kind of a fair criticism, but the implication is more that he's just blaming Democrats for foreign countries and the Japanese like bombing Pearl Harbor and a lot of other things. And that doesn't really play well with voters. And if you've ever seen Bob Dole speak, he's not necessarily the warmest or most charismatic person. So
is he still alive? How old is that man?
I think he's alive, actually. And I haven't heard any news of him dying. Yeah, I think he's still alive.
Jesus, he was born in 1920. This man is 96 years old. Sorry, just felt like that needed to be called out here.
Well, we'll talk more about Dole and kind of his quirky personality in the 1996 election when he's Clinton's challenger. But, Dole doesn't really do the Republicans a lot of favors here. Now, the campaign is close, and one of the things that I think inevitably helps Carter get an edge here is the impact of the media. And one of the key things the media does is kind of portray Gerald Ford as like this like goofy, like oafy jock. Which honestly is a bit of an unfair criticism, given that he is a smart guy. Dude went to Michigan and Yale, put himself through those places, didn't come from a lot of family wealth or anything like that. Gerald Ford is not one of the American blue bloods that, tend to dominate the history of American politics, but it's something that really kind of sticks with voters. And SNL actually does, in its, I think, first full year, in 1976, ends up becoming very influential in how people view the candidates, because Gerald Ford is constantly portrayed as this klutz. He's like tripping over things. There's this famous scene that is real, which SNL parodied, where he basically falls straight off the stairs of the tarmac onto the ground. Much like someone on this podcast, won't name who, but it's me. Gerald Ford once got stuck in an elevator. And that's something that I always find very funny. But Gerald Ford he gets this kind of bad rap from the media as this klutzy like jock. And they make fun of Carter too, but Ford is really the one who's probably most hurt by this on a negative basis. So you get that, but the gap really does close heading into election day. And this is really one of the closest elections in American politics. You can see by the electoral map, but you look at the state-by-state margins, it's even tighter. So kind of, Krishnan, do you want to walk us through the initial reads on the outcome?
Yeah, absolutely. So going into the election, Carter wins. He pulls out the victory, the dub versus Ford. He gets 297 electoral votes, 23 states, and I believe he wins actually a majority, not a majority, but a plurality of the popular vote.
No, he does win a majority.
Oh, he actually wins a majority. Nice
he does win a majority, yeah.
My bad. But yeah, so he wins a majority of the electoral vote. And, if we kind of look at the map, well, before we go into the map, maybe let's go over some of the overall high-level statistics between Carter and Ford, and then I can let Shravan talk a bit more about the map. But, basically what we see in this election is a little bit more of reversion to the mean when it comes to class-based voting. You'll remember in 72, Nixon kind of wins across the board. He wins the young, he wins the old, he wins unions, he wins non-unions, he wins men, women. Really, it's a bloodbath. But as we come back into 76, it's a much more even split. Carter dominates with the African-American vote. Actually, I found this to be interesting. Carter actually loses the youngest voters to Ford, 49-51, so those voters were 18 to 21. But then wins kind of the next groups of voters, so 22 to 44, wins those about 55-45 over Ford. And I think most interestingly, Carter wins lower income households. So households that make less than $8,000 a year go for Carter's 62-38. Households that make between $8,000 to $12,000 a year go for Carter's 60-40. And then only at the higher income levels as the Republican does Ford kind of reassert himself. And additionally, in terms of union households, which at this point make up about 30% of the US, Carter's winning 60-40 versus Ford. So what you see here is a lot of reversion to the mean, back to that class-based system of voting. And in a way, it's kind of the last gasp or the last hurrah of this system of voting, which is going to get totally blown up to some extent as we go into 80.
Absolutely. And just one other interesting thing that I found is, he wins the Catholic vote, which ends up becoming kind of the swing vote for American presidential elections over the last kind of 40 years. If with a candidate who can win the Catholic vote tends to win the election. But he does it interestingly in a time where Latinos make up a tiny proportion of the American electorate, Whereas today, almost a pretty significant portion of the Democratic Party's Catholic vote does come from Latino voters.
Mhm.
So Carter is winning over white ethnics in the Northeast. He's winning over kind of, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, a lot of the so-called hard hat workers who deserted the Democratic Party for Wallace or Nixon in 68 and 72. Carter's winning them back. And that theoretically should represent something good for the Democratic Party. We talked about the popular vote very briefly, but Carter's one of 5 Democrats in the post-Reconstruction era to win the popular vote, which is kind of insane, but I mean, you look at the political context, it may make a little bit more sense. The other 4 are Samuel Tilden, who actually never became president in
Stolen. I'm a
1876.
Tilden stan. I'm a Tilden truther. That election was stolen by the Republican Party.
uh, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who did it 4 times, very impressive. Lyndon Johnson in the greatest popular vote blowout in American history. And of course, Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. So that I think is a very interesting outcome. And again, we're talking purely on majorities, not pluralities. So that I think ends up becoming a very interesting factor in these elections is that Democrats really haven't won the popular vote with a lot of people since since the Civil War. So I don't know. I find that interesting to consider.
Yeah.
I guess onto the map. Chris, you want to talk a little bit about how the map reverts to kind of pre-civil rights vibes for a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the first thing that you notice when you take a look at a map of the 1976 election is that basically the Democrats reassert themselves in the South. Carter wins every state in the South with the exception of Virginia, which actually I think it's random piece of trivia, but it's one of the few times where basically Virginia and Florida don't vote alike. And then I think what's also really interesting, which you would never expect to see today, is how dominant the Republican Party is in the west of the United States. Basically, with the exception of Texas, the Republicans win every state west of the Mississippi, including the entirety of the Pacific Coast, California, Washington, Oregon, and Washington. And I think this is really interesting and would love to dive in a little bit more on the dynamics that are kind of driving that versus what's happening in the East. But basically, the Republicans win the entirety of the West. They win Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and then the far Northeast in New England, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and then Connecticut and New Jersey. And so it's a somewhat odd electoral map compared to what we see today, where I think to some extent you'd see it flip, but still definitely a fascinating one.
Yeah, and there are a couple kind of interesting notes here in terms of counties. You look at maps of Democrats winning, like a county map of Democrats winning, they tend to do really well in almost any area of the South. The entire South on a county basis, not just a state basis, is blue. And obviously it helps that Carter is a Southerner, but this is still like 12 years after the Civil Rights Movement. Lyndon Johnson said he'd lose the South for a generation, and I mean, he was right, but it waited a few years.
Yeah.
They're still winning the South here. And in part, that's both kind of poor whites and poor African Americans voting together. And part of the reason why the West is so Republican is that really the only kind of meaningful Latino voting bloc at this time is the Cuban voting bloc in Florida, which is voting for the anti-communists no matter what, which is probably going to go for Ford and the Republicans. So that I think is a little interesting and definitely relevant in how we kind of look at voting patterns in American politics. One thing about the West is just it is a much kind of wider part of the country, particularly the Pacific Northwest. And that's something that ends up, still being pretty close. There aren't the racial difference for white Americans isn't as deep in 1976 as it is in, say, 2016. But I think it is interesting how, that kind of like racial demographic trends influence the outcome of the election. And the last kind of state by state thing I'd have to say is, look at New Jersey. look at California, those are two states that also tend to vote very similarly. And, today I think we recognize both of them as being very democratic states, but those are states that I think have a lot in common. They're fairly wealthy. They tend to be pretty diverse. There are kind of strong political bases of power in the North and the South. And obviously I say this as someone from New Jersey, but these states tend to vote, in tandem over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st. I guess the last interesting thing to consider here is that, New York, Texas, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, which are four of the most populous 6 states, are within 5%. So the map could look very different if a couple things changed. And at this point, the Midwest is still kind of a power base for the Democratic Party. But if you flip a couple of those states and you flip one of New York or Texas, I mean, the map looks very different. And that, I think, is very fascinating here.
Yep, absolutely. So I think that does a good job of covering the election. I mean, I think this one is a weird one because there aren't that many interesting ideological debates to talk about between, Ford and Carter. I think they're relatively similar from that perspective. I think there's a little bit more of that ideology in the primaries, especially with, Reagan versus Ford coming up as sort of a key battle for the heart of the Republican Party. But yeah, I think this will lead us pretty nicely into the Reagan Revolution of 1980. So in our next episode, we'll walk you through sort of the malaise that was setting in the United States in the late 70s and how it sort of set the stage for, the revolution of 1980. And I think we'll be joined actually by our first ever guest, which I'm also very excited for.
All right. Sounds good. That's pretty much all I have to say. Krish?
Yeah. See you next time.
All right. Thank you guys very much. And again, always let us know feedback or comments.
And if you want to join us, please let us know. Till next time.